Well, we had some technical difficulties, lost the internet, but we were talking about the issue of anger and motivation and doing a big project, producing the kind of work that you produce that takes sustained attention over years. And I relate to that. I relate to the anger, getting angry and then going, okay, I got to correct this. But the question I had was, can is that sustainable? The anger as a motivation to do the work, or I mean,
Yeah, I mean it is for me because I have multiple audiences that I test the ideas and the anger out on.
hmm,
So if anyone were to follow me on social media over time, what you would see is that often some of my maybe rant or threads or kind of explosive ideas that I put out there 4 years later are books.
so the mass incarceration thing, that's not related to drugs? Is that what you were saying in that book? It's not
Well,
because of
I'll just
drugs?
give yeah, I'll just give an example of how that process might work, particularly with a topic like mass incarceration.
Okay.
Pretty popular idea that the reason for the spike in African American incarceration in the 1970s or the 1990s, particularly 1990s, was the drug war, the war on drugs.
How big a spike
And
are we
some
talking about? How big of a spike are we talking about?
I mean, we're talking. I mean, the last I checked, we had almost like 2.3 million incarcerated men and women in the system. 96% of those are going to be men. A large majority of those in state prisons and federal prisons are African American men. And and
A majority are African American?
if you look at some of the spikes in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that large increase
Uh-huh.
over that time was largely an increase in African American men.
Hmm.
Prisons in general reflect the general population. So if you look just a straight in number of incarcerated persons, the majority are going to be white because the majority of Americans right now are white.
Okay.
But if you look at the spike, the increase between the early 70s and 2000, that massive increase is going to be primarily African American men. And
Okay.
so the assumption was, well, that's because of the drug war.
Hmm.
And that just didn't make any sense to me
Hmm.
whatsoever. And people talk about on social media. There's a famous book that came out by Michelle Alexander called "The New Jim Crow,"
Oh yeah,
and
I
I
remember
thought,
that.
I
Yeah.
thought, I thought, man, something just doesn't seem right about that. So when I see a blindly accepted doctrine without people investigating or interrogating it, I start asking questions, right? I'm like, well, why aren't people questioning this? Because it just doesn't make any sense to me that the war on drugs would necessarily massively increase incarceration rates when, for example, during that same period, we had massive increases in violence and
That's true.
property crime,
Right.
right? But what the data actually shows is that's
I lose you.
I'm still here.
Okay.
So maybe increases in mass incarceration are actually about increases in criminality with respect to drug crime and property crime, particularly in low income areas and urban centers. Maybe that's the reason.
Right.
Put that on social media. People say, no, 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 you think you're crazy. You're crazy. I'm like, okay, well, let me find some data. Find data, write an article. Okay, article's out. Well, then let me go speak about this to some audiences and see how it turns out. So there's a social media issue. I write an article, then I go talk about it at some conferences. I get a lot of Q&As. And then I'm like, okay, I think I can do a book on this. But I use the feedback from the social media, from the Q&As from the audiences to sort of characterize and drive how I construct the whole project. What kind of issues should I talk about? And so once the book is out, I've probably been thinking about it and talking about it and speaking about it and writing about it in some form or another for probably 4 years.
Okay. Yeah,
So my most recent book, for example, is on college fraternities,
I saw that.
and that really came out of interacting with my students and seeing that there was something about male culture that
Did
has
you
some
have
issues.
fraternities at King's College?
So at the King's College, we had a house system, much like they have at Oxford. So there were 6 women's houses and 4 men's houses. I was the faculty advisor for the House of Winston Churchill. And this was a house of guys. They lived together. We did events together. It was sort of, like the reference that I use for people is Harry Potter, because they're like, oh yeah, I get that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we were at Oxford or Cambridge, they would have been in the same building, dorm building, would have had the same dinner jacket on with a patch on their pocket, on their blazer, etc. So over the years, I mean, the
Were you in a
student population.
fraternity? Were you in a fraternity in college?
Yes, yes. When I was at Clemson University, I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha Incorporated, founded at Cornell University in 1906. Famous alphas include Martin Luther King Jr.,
Wow.
Thurgood Marshall,
Really?
W.E.B. Du Bois.
Wow.
Yeah. So I can, and a whole list of others. Those are just some of the minor figures in American history.
Did you know that when you pledged? Is that why you wanted to go in there?
Sure, sure. Well,
Oh.
it's just sort of known in the Black community. There's just a number of, they're called the Divine Nine, which was these sort of 9 fraternities and sororities that really came to shape the destiny in many ways of the Black community beginning in the early 20th century to the present. One of the differences between the sort of white Greek world and the Black Greek world is that the main mobilization in Greek life happens after you graduate. So my mom is in her early 80s, and she still goes to sorority meetings.
Wow.
In Atlanta, she's in Delta Sigma Theta.
Where did she
So
go?
Martin Luther King, she graduated from Elizabeth City College in North Carolina, and it's a HBCU. Of course, my mom and my dad would not have been allowed to attend the college of their choice because it was during Jim Crow. So they had to attend a historically Black university in the South.
Okay. So this fraternity that you were in, the Clemson one, that was a Black fraternity?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well,
Okay.
we did have a white guy from Philadelphia, but historically Black. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So in other words,
And
you're not excluding white people, but it's mostly Black
no,
people that want to be in there.
Yeah, if a white guy wanted to pledge the fraternity, he wasn't prevented from doing so. It just rarely happened. It happens every now and then, but it's pretty rare.
Do you feel like it was a
when
healthy
that happens.
experience for you? Being in that?
Absolutely, it was fantastic and it was formative.
Okay.
And at least the ways in which it happens in the Black community, it's a very different experience. It's not so much about the partying and all that kind of stuff, although there is that. There is this sense, because of the history, that you're being prepped for service.
Okay.
Particularly service in the Black community. So the invitation was come and join a group of men who's really shaped not only sort of Black history but American history, and see what your contribution can be to that history.
I see. And so the idea for your fraternity book was, what was it that made you angry that you were trying to respond to?
Well, it wasn't so much anger; it was sadness.
Ah, a different
I was
emotion. A different
yeah,
emotion.
I
I'm
was
going to ask you to tie this all into love at some point because you're a Christian, right?
Yeah, sure.
I'm assuming so.
Yeah. Yeah, I was really, actually does tie to anger, because what I saw see still is a culture that, sees men as the problem. So there's that phrase, toxic masculinity,
Hmm.
and looking at fraternity guys as a bunch of problems to be fixed.
Okay. Yeah.
But when I looked at the data, when I looked at my own students, what I saw was a group of lost men
Mm.
who were struggling with anxiety and depression and a lot of pain from their parents' divorce.
Mm.
They had a sort of, a lot of them have addictions to various things.
Mm.
A lot of them struggle with suicide, all sorts of mental health issues and concerns, complete discouragement about their role in society because society's basically say we don't need you anymore,
Yep.
checked out,
Mhm.
withdrawn, and shamed. Especially in a lot of conservative churches, they get shamed for
What could
being men.
possibly go wrong with all
Right.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. So so when I so there was this disparity, and I thought, well, if there's one group of men historically who has any chance of saving the universities and the country, it's fraternities because of the history of where fraternity men end up later on. So if you look at American history since the mid 19th century, anywhere from 70 to 80% of all politicians, all CEOs, all judges, etc., were all in fraternities in college. We've only had two vice presidents in the history of this country after fraternities started. We've only had two vice presidents, for example, that were not in fraternities. In
Wow.
fact, Kamala Harris was in a sorority
Hmm.
when she was in college at Howard. She was in Alpha Kappa Alpha, which is the sister sorority to my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. So what fraternities tend to do is they produce the nation's leaders, at least leaders in the marketplace, but also leaders in politics. And I thought, man, well, this is a population that I think if we can orient them toward heroic virtue, a life of virtue, then I think we can make a pretty sizable dent in a lot of the pathologies that we see in our country. So instead of abolishing fraternities, I had this crazy idea that we should invest in them and make them better and invite these men to the cardinal virtues, invite them to prudence, invite them to justice, invite them to those things. And what I found over and over and over and over again, when I go to a college campus and I invite men to virtue, do you know what they
Hmm.
do?
What?
They enthusiastically sign up for it.
Wow.
And the one thing that I get repeatedly on campus after campus after campus is a phrase like this, and I'll never forget this student saying this to me. No one talks to us like this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the reasons that
Yeah.
we don't have a lot of young men who are living lives of virtue and honor and dignity and loyalty and temperance and peace and prudence, etc., is that no one's asking them to do it. It really is that simple. Just ask.
Wow.
No one's asking them. So what we're doing is that we're asking young men to not be bad,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
formation by negation.
Uh-huh. Oh.
Don't be misogynistic. Don't be an alcoholic. Don't watch porn, right? Don't be a rabble rouser. Don't be X, Y, and Z, but they don't know what they should aspire to and become.
Yes.
There's no character affirmation. There's no character model. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing there. In fact, I'll say it this way: we don't encourage them to love anything.
Whoa.
We just invite them to not be horrible things. And what I've seen over the last couple of years as I've immersed myself in this project and gone and traveled across the country to campuses talking to fraternity guys is that they want to be great men.
Mm.
Absolutely want to be great men. They want to
Yeah.
be men of honor and virtue and character, but they have no roadmap and no one's invited them to do it. They just don't know how.
When did all that click for you?
it really clicked for me. Well, there are two things. One, what I noticed is I teach a class. I taught a class at King's on the history of masculinity in America. We covered really around, when I say the history, not the whole history, but we kind of start around the early 19th century to the present, and just sort of looking at trends in masculinity, masculine culture, both in Christianity but also in secular culture. One of the units that I do in the course is the history of fraternities.
Mhm.
And what I began to notice is I was just Googling one day around, and I noticed that every single week somewhere in the country, this is back in 2012, 13, every week in the country, a fraternity was getting suspended somewhere. Every single week, a fraternity was getting suspended, getting kicked off a campus for either 1 year or 4 years or permanently. I'm thinking, what is going on? They were getting suspended, of course, for a lot of hazing issues. A lot of students have been dying by hazing fraternities. They've been suspended, or they've been completely uh, uh, like permanently kicked off campus for sexual assault. There have been some cases of racism as well, and
Mhm.
something, like property damage. But to me, that makes a lot of sense, right? A 19, 20-year old in college don't break something. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what they do. They break things. Okay.
Hmm.
But I begin to see these patterns, and I was thinking, these guys are like, this is not a sign of rebellion, right? This is the sign of emotional distress,
Yeah.
that they are struggling, like they're really, really struggling. And it really, I mean, I kind of had these ideas that, guys want to be great men. They really do, but no one's really invited them to do so. And I offered this heroic vision up. And there was a student at the University of Virginia by the name of Nick Fisher. He is in a fraternity called Sigma Phi Society. They go by Sigma Phi's or SERPs there on grounds at UVA. And he had somehow, I think on social media, stumbled upon my work and invited me to address his chapter. This is in the fall of 2021, November 2021, on grounds at UVA. And I will never forget it. I will never, ever, ever forget the experience of inviting a room full of men from multiple fraternities to a life of heroism and a life of virtue. And I framed it something like this: what it means to be a man is to use your power and your presence and your creativity for the purpose of benefiting other people. That everything about you is for the purpose of cultivating a sense of self and duty and honor. That your power and your strength and your presence and your creativity are really for the purpose of making your fraternity brothers' lives better, but also the lives of all the other students here on grounds at UVA. And that by doing so, you're setting yourself up for a life of public service in your communities that you're going to immerse yourself in when you graduate from the University of Virginia.
Mhm.
And I was nervous. I mean, I was scared to death because I thought, here I am at a very large school, very competitive school, extremely bright students.
Mhm.
And here I am inviting them to a life of the heroic. And to my surprise, at the end of my 35, 40-minute speech to them, I got a standing ovation.
Wow.
And they were enthusiastically clapping. And then we had probably about a 30 more minutes of Q&A session. And then I went to a bar with about 15 students from the University of Virginia, and we talked more about this for about 4 hours. And that's when it hit me.
And you had coffee only, right?
I had I had bourbon and Diet Coke with lime, but I had one,
All right.
or maybe two, maybe three. But we were involved in such intense conversations about masculine virtue and being a man on campus, and aspirations of being husbands and fathers, and it was just absolutely fantastic and beautiful. And I thought, this is it. In fact, it was the experience of those students on grounds at UVA that I actually changed the focus of the book project.
Hmm.
Because originally the book project was going to really be almost equally critical of fraternities to match a lot of the other books that I've written. But after being with these students for a few hours, it became a project of a sympathetic ear
Yeah.
directed at motivation and encouragement.
Mm.
And that was when the switch flipped in my mind, and I thought, I got to do this differently. And from that point on, it's been what it is.
Who published that book, the fraternity one?
After getting probably a dozen or so no's, I mean, I got a lot of no's from a lot of agents said no, a lot of even Christian publishers said no, a lot of main press folks said no. I published it with Whip and Stock there at West Coast with Eugene Origin,
Yeah.
and it's been a great partnership for me. I realize as I've looked at all the publications on fraternities that I'll have the only book that's advocating that fraternities can be good things.
Wow.
And when I looked at the acquisition editors at a lot of the university presses and other presses, when you look at their bios, there was one publisher who said we only publish books from a feminist perspective. That is right on their website. So if you're not a feminist, you can't get a book published with this publisher. This is, by the way, this is an academic press. So publishing a book saying fraternities are great and men can be great, and fraternity guys in particular can be great, we should invest in them, was probably not going to fly too well with a lot of the acquisition editors who tend to
Yeah.
kind of buy into the narrative that males are toxic by definition.
Do you believe in the demonic? Do you believe the demons are real?
Absolutely. I mean,
Is it?
yes,
Yeah.
100%.
To me, that feels demonic to me. Like I just feel like and I know that I have a view of human nature from scripture where James says, for example, that we ourselves fall into sin. Can't just blame it on the devil all the time. But when I see these massive uh, this social darkness at different places, and it does seem to be geolocated oftentimes. But you see, when you see stuff like that, I for me, I just feel like that's evidence of a sustained attention span that is beyond human beings to me, like that has a purpose that's not good. I don't know how you see it. How do you see it? How do you incorporate your worldview into how you're seeing everything? Christian worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I there's real opposition. I mean, one of the things that I learned in seminary from the Dutch Reform perspective
Yeah.
is that there's the kingdom of God, and then there's the parasite kingdom.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
And the parasite kingdom is the kingdom of the enemy, who seeks to kill and destroy everything God created good. We see in Genesis 1 and 2 that God created the creation is good, created men and women is good, was happy that he created men and women, and that the parasite kingdom is intent on destroying that at every aspect. So as a Christian personalist, for me to make the case
Can
that,
you define personalist just for other people that might not
yeah,
know what that is?
I will in just a second. For me as a Christian personalist, to make the case that young men can make positive contributions to their campuses and to the world, and that young men who are in fraternities are actually highly positioned to do so. To the parasite kingdom is not just anathema, it's a threat, because the one population on a college campus that kind of sets the tone for the campus culture is Greek life, particularly at large state schools. The social thermostat in terms of what's normed on campus is often set by Greek life. So if we get, I'll just pick a big state school, University of Oregon, right? University of Idaho, Michigan State, Texas. If the fraternities at Arizona State University are all pursuing a life of virtue, all the other men on campus are going to do the same thing. If the men on the university, if the fraternity men at Arizona State University are pursuing a life of vice, then all the other guys are going to pursue a life of vice. They're just going to norm it that way. And so that's a real threat to the parasite kingdom, which seeks to kill and destroy and undermine all the goodness that God has in the creation itself. So yeah, it's going to be opposition and resistance to a project like mine that's seeking to bring out the goodness, the good potential, and the images of God that are male. I use the word personalist on purpose. It comes out of sort of Christian social thought tradition. The personalist tradition really emerged after World War I, began to formulate itself there, really began to see it after World War II as well. It's often associated with Emmanuel Monier. And it's a way of thinking about politics and economics and public policy, society and culture by keeping the human person at the center. So one way to think about what personalism does, it's going to ask a certain set of questions. If God has made the human person with certain characteristics, capacities, capabilities, potentials, etc., what sort of structures and institutions and frameworks should we erect in society that allows people who are made in God's image to live that image out? What sorts of political structures and economic structures and social structures allow human beings to actually image in real life and practice what it means to be in the image and likeness of God? So it looks at the attributes of the human person. You could think of some of the both the communicable and the non-communicable attributes of God, right? And then says, okay, what kind of institutions help support the family, help support love, help support creativity, help support education, right? Things like that, compassion, things like that. And so what the personalist tradition did is to think about justice and social justice in particular in terms of what it means to keep the person at the center. So one variation on this theme is the framing of human flourishing. You've probably heard that phrase. Now, the personalist tradition was something that inspired figures like Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, he studied personalism at Boston University for his Ph.D., and he used personalism as a framework for the entirety of the civil rights movement. So if you remember, particularly in Memphis, there were some signs, some placards that were made that just read, "I am a man."
Yeah.
And that framing of the civil rights movement was a personalist framing. Francis Schaeffer also was a personalist. He really used personalism, keeping the person at the center in the Labrie center framing, bring people in with their questions, address their issues, talk about the gospel in terms of that as well. Pope John Paul II was also a personalist. Keeping the person at the center was the basis of the pro-life movement and things like that. So that tradition is something that I've used.
So some people are familiar with Ayn Rand, and they think of individualism. But of course, she was an atheist, and she famously had a spat with William F. Buckley, who was Catholic, and they didn't see eye to eye on the broader understanding of what a human being is. She imported her atheism from the Soviet Union. Ironically, I think it undermined a lot of what she was trying to do. Uh, is that focus on the individual made in the image of God have a lot to do with how you see public policy, for example, at Acton?
Well, I would say that the difference between the Randians and the objectivists is is the distinction between person and individual.
Okay.
So what do you get with the sort of classical liberals and a lot of the libertarians? They're going to talk about self-interest and individual rights and things like that. That's different than personhood, or what it means to be human. So I think one of the differences in the Christian tradition is the intentional use of the word person, which really
Isn't
informs
that
this
the
idea.
subject of the rights? The subjects of the person is a subject of rights and responsibilities.
It is, but the difference is that in the Christian tradition, there's really no such thing as an individual. You're a person, but you're not an individual. You are interconnected by definition and dependent on other people. You're interdependent as a person. Persons need other persons for flourishing. There's
Okay,
no other way to have it, right?
I
We're
see.
not reptiles. You're born into a family and you are interdependent on other people. And so that God made you into a person.
Hmm.
So there's some sort of Trinitarian influence there. It's three persons, not three individuals, but three persons. So that this sort of framing of personhood is absent in a lot of the secular framings like the Randians. So the Randians' problem is their anthropology's off. And that's some of the limitations there. And so you see that in a lot of their ethics. So for example, one major difference is that if God has made us into persons with this sort of intersubjectivity, interconnectedness, it demands a certain type of virtue that fosters real human flourishing. So there's some moral implications there that the objectivists are going to be like, well, hey, as long as I do it, as long as I'm free as an individual to do whatever I want to do, as long as I don't infringe on the rights of somebody else to do what they
Yeah,
have, what they want to do, then that's morality.
right. I
Person that
gotcha.
says, well, it
Yeah,
still might not be good, it
yeah.
might not be virtuous, it might not build the human person into a more glorious person. Even though you may be free to do it, it might not be great or good.
A while ago, we were talking about anger and your motivation, and I really relate to that. Now, as a Christian, how do you understand the proper role of anger in academics and the Christian life and in social advocacy like you're doing?
I see it as a variation on the things that, at least in the scriptures, that God gets angry about. So God is angry at evil, gets angry about unrighteousness, gets angry about hypocrisy. And so, insofar as I'm seeking to be a type of scholar who images God, follows God, I want to be angry about the right things. So when you think about it this way, what's it mean to celebrate the things that God celebrates, but also to lament the things that God laments, and also to be righteously angry at the same things that might be righteously angering to the God of goodness and creation. So it helps me in one sense to not care about some things that people get all angry about.
Mm.
And in other ways, I get more animated than some people about things that people might find not too objectionable. I get really, really angry. For example, I get, I mean, one of the things that blows my top completely is bearing false witness.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's something that, because I mean,
Yeah.
there's a reason that's in the Ten Commandments. I mean,
Mm.
it can destroy people, right? So when I see people lying about other people, distorting their words, I almost have a stroke, because that just makes me so angry. I'm okay with people disagreeing. That's fine. I'm even okay with people maybe making an ad hominem comment here and there because they're immature and they can't handle the discourse. We're sinners, whatever. But to misrepresent someone in either their speech or their actions, to me, is just absolute evil. Right? So I really try to use that as a way to motivate and sustain interest. One of the things that you'll know as a scholar is that, listen, it takes months or even years to get something published, and just being mildly interested in something doesn't sustain the drudgery of having to submit, revise, wait and wait and wait and wait and wait on something to finally come out. The timeline between having an idea and a book being published is 2 years minimum. It's
Wow.
2 years. For those of your listeners who are philosophers, I mean, they'll tell you that the publishing in an academic journal might be 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Right? So I mean, to me, I'm just like this. I mean, I have to have some level of emotional connection to the topic in
Oh
order to
yeah.
sustain this
Yeah.
process of getting published.
Yeah. You're an
I
interesting
think
you're an interesting guy, and I'm trying to figure you out. I feel like I don't normally hear people talk about anger so just blatantly. And I really relate to it. I think I find it to be refreshing, especially from Christian. When this is sometimes we get into politics here on the Republican Professor podcast. It has been known to happen. And I just, I'm obviously people get angry and with the politics and stuff. Do you have hope about the future in terms of politics? Where do you come down on your hope or how you perceive interaction in the American political community?
I think I have a sense of Christian realism. In that sense, I'm kind of resurrecting Reinhold Niebuhr in the 1950s and 60s. Reinhold Niebuhr was a Christian realist. I think Christian realism has waned a bit, sadly. But it's this basic understanding that, listen, our world is complicated by sin and pride. Of course, pride comes in two forms: the pride of self contempt and self degradation, the pride of self aggrandizement, and anxiety. There's just a lot of uncertainty as well about the future. There's a lot of unknowns and there's just a lot of mystery. We're not going to have heaven on earth, but there's an approximation on some issues that we can make the world to be a place that is as centric focus as possible, but just having some realistic
That
expectations about that.
that little thing right there that you said about there is the possibility of progress and there is a even though it's not going to be perfect, but how to make progress, how to get that possibility is an interesting topic. Because I mean, you look at certain parts of the world and they're just like hellholes. Look at North Korea, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, for decades and decades and decades, and the difference between South Korea and North Korea, and they're right there, right next to each other. you know, Same language, same mostly history. That's just an example. I mean, it could give you tons of examples. It could give you examples in the United States.
Sure. I have a
So how do
long
you,
view of things.
yeah,
I have a long view of things. So it's certainly the case that parts of even the US are facing some horrible situations right now, but it's better than it was 200 years ago.
yep,
I promise you that.
yep,
And that's a lot better than it was 1,000 years ago.
amen.
Right. So I have a longer view of history. I recognize, and this is sort of this understanding of planting seeds, someone else watering it, God makes it grow sort of framework, that the work that we're doing right now, we may never see the fruit of it. And I'm okay with that. I'm perfectly fine with planting seeds of virtue and righteousness and goodness and not living long enough to see the fruit of that labor, because that's the history of God's people. That's the history of Israel. That's the history, that's the sort of redemptive story that we see from Genesis to Revelation. That God has always done things with generations, and the generations with whom he did things, the succeeding generations often never got to see the good fruit of that, ever. Right? Moses didn't get to cross over.
Yep.
He didn't. Right? You think Joshua got to saw? I mean, Joshua didn't get to see what David did. I mean, David didn't get to see what Jesus did. Right? So there's this whole history, and I'm like, Christians, chill out.
Hmm.
The framing here is eternity, not your lifetime. And so you can lament recent history, but if you look at the big picture historically, we're doing okay. I mean, yeah, we got some issues and some problems, but I'm hopeful about the future because I'm thinking about it. A, big picture. B, long view. Why do I work with students? Because I
Right.
recognize that it's worth. I'm planting seeds of hope in the future that the students with whom I invest are going to bear fruit after I'm gone.
What makes you the
I may.
most what makes you the most hopeful and what makes you the most angry right now?
I think what makes me the most hopeful. This might sound a bit crazy, is that the norms are in complete disarray.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the
A,
on the
a,
one side
a
these
lot
sort
of
of
people are feeling anxiety from the instability of basic social institutions, including like marriage,
absolutely,
gender.
yeah, absolutely. But I also see that as an opportunity to bring what's to have to make the case for why these things are good in the public square, and we didn't have to do that 80 years ago. It was just an assumption.
Wait, this is your hope, right? The hope is the
Yeah,
most hopeful thing is the opportunity that we have.
yeah, this is great. This is great because it's actually going to force us in the way of apologetics to make the case for marriage,
Mm-hmm.
to sort of make the case for why religion's good, right? To make the case for why limited government, because they've just been an assumption in the past. So I see it as an opportunity. I think the thing that makes me the most angry, which gets me the most discouraged, is the role of trauma and addiction in undermining people's ability to flourish. I've just been watching a lot of videos of young adults whose lives are being sabotaged by fentanyl and the opioid crisis and addictions to food, addictions to alcohol, addictions to pleasure. These are the sorts of things, and a lot of young people experiencing massive traumas in their life. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, divorce is a massive trauma in a child's life. When you wed addiction and trauma, and then look at the basic cohort of growing up in America as a child, we're screwed in that sense because an addicted, traumatized individual can't won't flourish in a healthy way as a teen or young adult. They're not going to form families well. They're not going to enter their marketplace well. They're really going to struggle. You talk about demons. I completely believe in the demonic. It's in the Bible. It's real. If you travel across the country in developing context, you'll see it's a regular part of the conversation. One of the things I love about the Black church tradition is the Black church, we talk about the devil all the time. It is fresh in the minds of people, sometimes too fresh, but it's there. The devil's there.
I relate to
And
that.
I think if you think about the craftiness of how the enemy works in the States, you undermine people's flourishing. Well, idolatry, I'll say the sort of three things: idolatry, trauma, and addiction. People worshiping stupid things like money and career materialism, addictions to their stupid cell phones, to food, to sex, to drugs and alcohol. And then the amount of child abuse we have in this country is outrageous to me. It's unnerving, the amount of abuse of children that we have. And when I say abuse, I mean both abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, but also neglect. So if children are raised in a context of idolatry and trauma and addiction, that's the stuff I get. That's the stuff I rant against the most, because I see it completely eclipsing the wings of people and their ability to sustain a morally virtuous, positive life of service where they can make contributions to making the world better. I mean, think about the number of politicians who've been taken out because of this stuff.
Oh yeah.
The number of pastors who've been
Pastors.
taken out because of this stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The number of academics. I mean, it's becoming an epidemic in academia to see a professor whose career has been completely sabotaged because he lacked moral virtue and was dating a student or something crazy like that.
Crazy.
Right?
Actors.
I remember
Yeah.
when I was in college.
Athletes,
I
actors.
remember
Yeah.
absolutely. I remember when I was when I was in college at Clemson, I was a biology major, and the
Really?
big drama in the biology department at Clemson was we came back from summer, and this one professor who had hair, I mean, down to her waist, she cut it all off, and her hair was really short, and we were like, what happened? Well, over the summer, her husband, who was also in the biology department, had an affair with his grad student on some marine biology trip, and it destroyed the synergy of the whole biology program at the college. It was absolutely horrible. So those are the sort of things that make me angry and kind of, sort of introduce some hopelessness, because I see the enemy working in really unique ways in those areas.
How do you do self-care? Because it seems exhausting what you do. Like with all these kids, you're going to UVA and you're hanging out with them for hours and hours and hours. I'm assuming that you're really personally available at that moment. You're not just like, your eyes glazed over. Do you keep in touch with these people? Is this just part of
I do.
ministry? That seems
I
exhausting to me. How do you have the
well,
energy for that?
I'm a massive extrovert. I
Oh,
actually
that's
get
helpful.
energy.
That's nice.
Yeah,
I
I'm a
wish I had
strange
that.
academic. Yeah, I'm a very bizarre academic in the sense that I
Wow.
am high on the extroversion. In
I'm
fact, I
jealous of
don't
you.
do well. I don't do well in isolation. I mean, why did I go to the bar with those students for 4 hours? Well,
I'm assuming the
one, because it
apps
was
were good.
yeah, they were. On the one hand, I needed to recharge from the talk that I gave. There's no better way for me to recharge than to hang out with people. But then secondly, I wanted to do some more research and get some more information. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think self-care for me includes making sure I'm connecting well with people
Mhm.
in general. I do watch a fair amount of college football. That is
Not
an
the NFL.
absolute.
Not the NFL.
I do. I mean,
Football, college versus NFL. What's better?
well, I mean, college football is 10x better than the NFL. The NFL is boring and predictable. Although sometimes it can get exciting, but it's usually not exciting to the playoffs, much like the NBA. college games are completely unpredictable because you have a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds who are one day they're great and on and awesome, and one next week they're just rubbish. It's you don't know what's going to happen.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
On Saturdays, I'll usually watch game day from 9 to about noon. I'll watch at least 2 games, sometimes 3 on Saturday. The NFL on Sunday is sort of background noise, just in
Gotcha.
the background,
Okay.
while I might take a nap or cook a meal or maybe run some
Did
errands.
you
But
play football? Was that important for you playing?
I did not. I became a college football addict at Clemson. When I was in high school, college football was not a big part of my family's life. We were kind of NFL fans, Major League Sports fans. And I went to Clemson knowing nothing about big D1 Southern college football. Nothing. I'd never been to a college football game in my life, ever. And the first game as a freshman, Clemson played Furman. I walked in a stadium of something I'd never seen in my life, 80 plus thousand people
Wow.
wearing the same things, chanting the same chants, singing the same songs on cue.
Oh yeah.
And it was like a religious conversion. I was like, what is this? I'll never forget it. I was so
That's your
taken.
fentanyl for an extrovert. That's what gets you high.
Yeah. I was so euphoric. It was like being in the seventh heaven as one was. I was so high off that experience of being around all those people. I called my mom and I was hoarse. I could barely talk because I was screaming and yelling with all these other students in the student section. It was like the best thing ever. And I tell you, at that moment, there was no way under the sun I was going to transfer from Clemson and go anywhere else. And the fact that I had 4 years of that just completely cemented me in college football. I had a roommate once.
Yep.
We followed 70 college football teams in one season.
Wow.
7-0.
And so, did you follow the individual players? Did you know the actual names of the individual players too? That's
We
a lot of
did,
information.
particularly.
Wow.
Yep, we did, but we committed time to this, right? Because it was that important, and we did it and partly as recreation and a way of connecting, but it was a
Yeah.
way of getting involved deeply, kind of deep learning, deep
Yeah, and it
research,
keeps you out of
whatever.
trouble too. I mean, you're not going to get in trouble if you're doing stuff like that. But that goes to your don't do this formation. But it sounds like a good way to do some self care to me. That's good. You have
Yeah,
some healthy habits. Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
I
yeah,
don't
it's
understand how the
social, right?
southern I don't understand how the southern people play in the heat. That's what I just don't get. Like I grew up in Colorado. The humidity. I mean, I see these people playing in like Texas and Florida and South Carolina is where Clemson is, right?
It is.
South Carolina is very hot in the summertime. And you don't sound like you're from the South. Are you from the South?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. I'm from Atlanta.
You are from Atlanta. Okay. You've talked about
Yeah,
your
I had
mom
to.
a bit, but do you have a dad? What's your dad?
Yeah, I do.
Are you close with him?
Yeah. I mean, we're relatively close for a man of his generation.
Mm-hmm.
My parents have been married for 60. Oh, wow. Maybe 60. I have to count. Maybe 63, 64 years they've been married
Mm-hmm.
that long, which I've been really, really blessed to have. Um, just grew up basic middle class. My mom was kind of worked in education at school, teaching. My dad careered at the post office.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we kind of lived. The way I describe my upbringing was the show Leave It to Beaver, but everybody was black. I mean, that's kind of
Okay. Gotcha.
the framing of it. So everybody went to church. There was basically
Yeah.
no divorce in my neighborhood. 2-parent families, station wagons, soccer. We had go karts, ice cream. It was America. It was great.
Did you guys go like hunting and fishing? Were there any guns or anything in your family at all? Like, what was their role of
Not really. I
firearms?
mean,
Okay.
there was a rifle in the home, but in the South, I think everybody probably had
Yeah.
something
Okay.
back. I think it might have been it was a single barrel. Yeah, it was just rifle. I grew
Yeah.
up in I was also heavily involved in the Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout,
Oh, cool.
and so
Oh, that's
outdoor
awesome.
stuff was really important. Yeah, beginning seventh grade, I was camping
Oh,
once
that's
a
cool.
month for 6 years.
Yeah.
Uh, Backpacking in North Georgia mountains and East Tennessee, Alabama, etc. So
So
stuff
this,
was great.
you had a really stable background, good parents, good jobs, great community around you. At some point, you left the United Methodists, I'm assuming. How did that whole conversion happen?
Yeah, it was basically social. It wasn't like I didn't have any issues with the Methodist Church. I just when I went to college at Clemson, I got a bunch of friends that were in the
Are your folks still
Presbyterian Church in
Methodists?
America.
Are
They
your
are.
folks?
They're
Are they?
still.
Did
Yeah, they're
that cause
still
any
at the church.
attention?
No, no, not at all. No, they're in the same Methodist church that I was raised in,
Wow.
and that church. I think people may not be aware of this, but the Methodist Church had segregated churches for a very long time, up until probably the late 1970s, early 80s. So I was in a predominantly black Methodist church, which was in terms of the conservative liberal scale, conservative, because as most black churches are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it was theologically conservative and theologically Wesleyan. I mean, I would, if I was at my parents' home church recently, and they were actually quoting from Wesley directly in a sermon. So
Wow.
classically Wesleyan in that sense. So very conservative theologically. And so, when I came into the PCA, it wasn't like I was leaving Methodism because I was against the set of doctrines. I just had a bunch of friends. Again, as an extrovert, just had a bunch of friends who were Presbyterian. I probably could easily become Anglican or Orthodox or something if I had a bunch of friends who were Orthodox as well. I wasn't really principled that way back then. It was mostly social. They were nice people, and I'm an extrovert.
And your PhD's from Westminster, which is that whole tradition of the Reformed. And if you're barely keeping on, listener, because you don't know like the what happened after the Protestant Reformation and all that stuff. Wow. But it's to me, I see you seem like you're somebody from like 50 years ago. Like to me, because people don't talk about these doctrinal differences anymore, it seems like to me. I mean, it's like I went to a Baptist college and I'm glad they still have the word Baptist in there because all sorts of like I was married in a Baptist church and they took the word Baptist out. These these guys are taking the denominational they're calling it a community church or something like that. And it's like there I'm finding my students don't know basic things about the denominational differences and and like they did like 50 years ago. Average people seem to know something about what the difference was between a, a Presbyterian and an Anglican or something like that. So you're like, I feel like you're like from 50 years ago and like a healthy person coming to talk to people today and to help people today. Like the message of hope and virtue. Can you clarify what virtue is? Are you talking about the biblical virtues? How do people know what a virtue is? And
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, yeah, I sort of I use that word on purpose uh, to disarm people. And when I use virtue, I am really talking about a particular orientation toward the good.
Mhm.
And what I find is that
When you
no one's
say the
against it.
good, though, I mean people don't normally talk that way. So I know what you mean because I'm a philosophy guy. I taught philosophy, but when you
Yeah.
say the good, uh, tell me Tell us what that is. What you mean, just abstractly, or you have a concrete? I don't like the term concrete, but
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just depends on the audience, right?
okay.
I am so when I use these words, these terms in
Yeah.
particular, it's for the
Yeah.
purpose of disarming people
Okay.
and bringing them into a discourse, so that later on they say, no, what do you mean by that, and where are you getting that from? Um, so
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I want people to relax and listen to the ideas and the discourse. And I mean, my definition of course, the sort of grounding of my definitions are going to come directly from the scriptures in terms of where I get things from ultimately.
Hmm.
But I'm actually okay with an Aristotelian definition or something like that, or I'm okay with those definitions as far as they go, because it opens up space for dialogue and discourse and challenge and growth. I don't I don't necessarily need to have everybody have the precise definition of things like virtue and good in order to advance a discussion in contradistinction with evil. I don't necessarily require that.
I see.
And I'm also open to people having some distinctions in their own definitions and their own sources of what the good is. I think I'm enough of a common grace theologian that has space for multiple variations on what good is and what virtue is. I'm okay with a philosophical definition. I'm also okay with a Christian definition, a Jewish definition, a Muslim definition. I'm okay having those within the context of the conversation, so that we can seek the truth together. So bring all your discussions of the good and virtue and morality and goodness and greatness and beauty, and let's continue to tease that out until we can get something really, really concrete that can help us.
What's do you miss New York City? I mean, you're
I haven't
in
been away.
Michigan now, so that's quite a
Yeah,
difference.
yeah. I've been here about 2.5 months. I used to live here though, so it's not completely foreign territory. I lived here in the early 2000s for about 3 years. I do miss New York.
What do you miss
I
about it?
don't miss. Well, I'll tell you what I don't miss about New York is the constant smell of marijuana. Now
Oh, wow.
it's just constant. It's horrible.
That's
You
fairly
can't
new,
go in
right?
man.
That's
Yeah, it
fairly
is.
new.
You can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it used to just be the smell of urine and water and sort of you know standing water, right?
Hmm.
But now it's urine and marijuana kind of mixed together as a general fragrance in the air. Don't miss that part. I think, as I've told people about the demise of Kings, I think I miss Kings more than I'm going to miss Kings more than I'm going to miss New York. The thing about New York City is that there are things called airports, and you can get on these things called airplanes, and you can go and experience that as much as you want. I mean, I could fly back every weekend if I could afford it. Not a big deal.
You
But
said you still have an
Kings is
apartment there?
I do,
Or
and I've got people renting in there
okay.
right now. But
Oh, I
yeah,
see.
so
So
when
you
I
can't
go,
just go in there
yeah,
and kick them out.
well, I could, I
Yeah,
could.
yeah,
I
you
mean, I,
could.
I do still have, yeah. I mean, I do still have a room that I can use, a bedroom
Oh,
I can use in that apartment. So, and I have gone back a couple of times, and I'm sort of back home in one sense. But I think Kings is something that's sort of a bigger lament than missing New York City. I had said it for years, and was always true, that if Kings packed up and moved to Iowa, I would pack up and move to Iowa. I
wow.
think the things that we were doing were so unique and good that that they couldn't be replicated anywhere else. And what we did for students, I think, was so helpful and good. And I got to see that firsthand. I wanted us to move to Philadelphia because that's my favorite city in the country.
Why?
I just had a great time there, great people there. It
Yeah.
has everything New York has. Small, it's a slightly smaller scale, and
Uh-huh.
you can get to nature much,
Yeah.
much quicker
Yeah.
and easier. And the people I met in Philadelphia, just really loyal, great
Mm.
friends. One in Philadelphia culture, they're straightforward like everywhere else in Northeast.
Yeah.
But once you're
Uh-huh.
in. And these
Yeah.
are some of the
Yeah.
most loyal and committed friends you're going to have. In California, people are fake.
That's where I'm at.
So in Southern California, right? In
Have
Southern
have you
California in
have you heard of
particular,
Azusa Pacific University?
I have.
That's where I'm teaching. And
Okay.
I feel like Azusa is hanging on by a thread financially, just like Biola actually. Of course, Biola just got a big gift from the In-N-Out burger people. So I think that was for just one department, but
That was for their business department.
was it the
Yeah.
business department? Okay. All right. You
Mm-hmm.
follow
Yeah,
these
they got
things?
I
Yeah.
do. I follow them now uh, in the last few years because I've just seen a number of schools close. So I'm always curious about the ones that remain open and getting big gifts.
I'm
What I've
interested
seen
in what
is that
you're saying about
schools,
like California. You were saying they're fake. Yeah, tell me about that.
well, just in terms of the friendships, and especially Southern California, people are nice, but they're trying to use you for something, right? And if you're not, if you aren't, if you can't add value to their life, they'll just move on to somebody else, right? Um, it's just a different, it's just a
It's
much more
very
transactional culture.
okay. That's interesting to hear because I'm not sure I have enough to compare it with because I've been here for so long. I did grow up in Colorado, but I I feel like it takes so long to get anywhere here that it's very difficult to sustain community, and it takes a long, long time to develop friendships is what I've noticed. Since I have had moments where I wonder, do I have any friends here? And I've had that thought many times here, and I've been here 20 years. So that's interesting to hear that. Makes me wonder what it's like somewhere else like Philadelphia.
Well, I mean, Philly culture is great. I mean, they'll not only be your friends, but they'll commit a crime for you, right? I mean, they're sort of
Sounds like the
that
mafia.
that it does. It's fantastic. These guys are so committed to. I mean, I've got people that I know would die for me without thinking about it, and that was just in making friends within a couple of years. I mean, that's how loyal. Just the sense of loyalty there is just really outstanding.
You're an interesting guy. Are you married?
I am
Got any?
not.
Okay. I was about to ask you if you had any kids, but I'm assuming not.
I also don't have any kids. I was in a barbershop a few years ago, and it was one of those moments where you might hear a record scratch back in the 70s or 80s. The whole barbershop was stopped because someone asked me if I had any kids, and I said no. And then everybody turned. It was like screech. Music stops. Everyone turned and looked at me, and it was almost like it was said in unison in the barbershop. Several people were like, "You don't have any kids?" Now, mind you, almost everyone who was in the barbershop was not married,
Oh, I
but they
gotcha.
all had kids,
Oh
right?
yeah, I
I
gotcha.
was strange
Yeah.
because I didn't have any kids, but they were normal because they all had kids with multiple partners. It was just kind of this interesting. I was like, well, I'm not married, so I don't have any kids. And they were like, you don't have any kids? I was like, no, I'm not married. But you're not married and you have lots of kids with lots of different people.
See, that's what I mean. You're like I said 50 years ago, but I didn't do the math right. Should have been 70 years ago, I think. 70 years is maybe a better number. Yeah. So how do you approach like dating or whatever? Do you have hope about this? I can't imagine what it's like to be single nowadays. I mean, if you're interested, are you interested in becoming married?
Yeah, of course.
I
I, I
feel like
think
you're I
I think
feel like you're Jewish grandpa right now or something.
well, I think it's often just depends on the context, right? In New York City, being a non-married professional is no big deal. Nobody even talks about it.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I see that.
When you're in more suburban contexts,
Yeah.
it's a bit alien there. At the King's College, I think one of the reasons why it was such a unique place is that it's probably the only Christian college in America where I'd say anywhere from 25 to 30% of the faculty were single.
Mm.
You just don't see that. You don't see that. So our students got an interesting vision of adulthood. On the
Yeah.
one hand,
Right.
you had a lot of us who were not married. You had a lot of couples who were married with children.
Hmm.
We had some couples who were married and they weren't able to have their own biological children and adopted lots of kids, which I thought was
That's
a
cool.
beautiful thing for our students to see as well. So our students were really introduced to those different models of being a single adult, being a married adult with kids, but also adoption. We had a massive adoption culture on our faculty, which is so admirable and praiseworthy. And inter, I think they don't cross cultural adoption, I think is the phrase, or intercultural adoption, I think is the phrase. So we had lots of professors who adopted special needs kids from all over the world, including uh, places like China. We also had faculty members who adopted ethnic minority kids. I mean, white faculty members who adopted minority kids, which was also extraordinary. So at King's, it really wasn't strange or odd in that sense to be a part of that cohort of faculty members who weren't married. It's certainly not a big deal in New York City because you have lots of that there in the professional class.
Do you mind if I pray for you?
Sure.
My grandpa always
I don't mind.
asked people, and I was like, why don't you just pray for them? Why do you have to ask permission? Lord, I ask, Father, we ask that you would, by the power of your Holy Spirit, have your protective and providential hand on this scholar's life and his work, and that you would make it go forth and be productive and bear much fruit, and that you'd bring a partner together with him, a woman of God, to share in this and to share life together. I ask you this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Brother, I know I've kept you a long time and we had some very difficult technological issues, and I'm very impressed with your demeanor and how you handled that disruption. You handled it a lot better than I did. I had a lot of anxiety and I was really upset, and you seemed to be so calm. And you're the one talking about anger.
Well, I have a podcast myself, and so I've been on the other side of that.
Okay.
I know exactly
So
how
you
that
know,
feels.
gotcha.
I know exactly how that feels to have your technology glitch. I've been there. I've been there.
I really appreciated it because I didn't
You have
have your
no
phone
idea.
number. I didn't have your phone number, and I really appreciated your patience and your virtue and your kindness.
Yeah, I have.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I know exactly what it feels like. So the last thing I wanted to do was add any because I know what he's feeling right now.
Mm.
Because I've been there. This has happened to me before, and I panic. I start sweating. I'm thinking, oh my gosh! I'm like clicking buttons. The stuff isn't working. The browser's loading really slow. It's like, all day it works great, and then right when you need it,
I really feel like we got Anthony Bradley unplugged here. I feel like we got a real nice spectrum of who you are and the kind of work you do. And now I want to go out and get that fraternity book. I don't have it yet, but I'm going to go get it.
yeah.
And
Oh, great, thank you.
I'm going to link these books in there. Did you want
Okay.
to say anything about Acton or anything? I'm going to link that too. Um, If you don't know what Acton is, check it out. Check out the Acton Institute. It's how would you summarize what the mission is?
Yeah, I would say really, really concretely here that we are at Act 10 um, a ecumenical think tank in the best way. So it was sort
Mhm.
of drawing from the best of the Catholic and Protestant traditions,
Yeah.
really for the purpose of advocating for a society that is both free and virtuous. That's why I use the word virtue so much, is both free economically, politically, and religious free and virtuous. Why is that? Because you can't have freedom without virtue. You can't have markets function without morality. You can't have limited government without a people that are oriented toward the good. It just does not work. It just doesn't work at all. So we're advocating for that. For that, of course, more broadly, more narrowly, we are trying to find the best solutions to poverty in this country and around the world that we can find, drawing from the best of the religious traditions, and that includes Christian and in some cases Muslim and Jewish, kind of drawing from the Abrahamic religions in particular, to try to find some of the best solutions to poverty around the world in ways that sustain societies that are both free and virtuous.
You talk like a preacher, and I love it. You have a cadence that it's got that power of the pulpit, and I think it really accents the work you do in the scholarship. I think it's a very interesting combination, and I'm so grateful for the time that I've had with you today, Anthony.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. This is fantastic.
God bless you.
You too.